Annabelle shut up, woken by a sudden metallic clanging. It was as though the town's blacksmiths were right outside her bedroom window. She quickly glanced around the tent, trying to find the source of the noise. There wasn't much natural light. It must have only barely been morning by now, but she could make out her surroundings inside the tent. Not that those surroundings were reassuring. She couldn't see a thing. Where had Philip gone? What about his sleeping bag? His backpack? Why was the room so barren? Where even was her own bag? She spun around again, frantically grabbing at where she had left it close to the edge of the tent. Annabelle let out a sigh of relief when her hand hit the bag, the rough imprints of her tools pressed into its side. She cautiously got up, making more noise than she wanted as she slipped out of her sleeping bag. On any normal day, the slight rustle would have been forgotten and done with in an instant, but today, Annabelle was terrified of drawing the attention of whatever awaited her outside. It was a somewhat familiar noise in a horribly unfamiliar place. To make matters worse, she could hear the crackle of the leaves as the beast skulked around. It was all she could hear aside from the wind and her own breath as she moderated every bit of air passing through her lips. She peeked through the front flap of the tent and glanced around, expecting to see signs of a giant or some monster, or maybe even come face to face with the behemoth. Instead, she was greeted by a much warmer view, as a crackling campfire's heat before her could be felt in just its vibrant shades of red-orange. The flames leaped upwards, reaching for a small piece of meat hoisted above the fire with a skewer. Philip sat on a log, gnawing on something. At least the campfire had given a source to the crackling noise. Considering Philip's relaxed state, the metal clanging had probably been from something he'd done. Annabelle relaxed, letting out a small sigh of relief, and stepped out of the tent. "Oh, look," Philip said between bites. "The child's awake." He glanced at her while continuing to scarf down his meal. Annabelle just sort of stood there in silence, taking in the scene. She was a bit exhausted after having such rough sleep that night. Annie slowly stepped outside the tent, a waft of cool morning air greeting her with a smell of fresh dew and a rugged, smoky hint of the campfire. A dim wave of sunlight leapt over the canopy's edge, casting a glow on the campsite's clearing. It felt familiar, welcoming. One of the few things Annabelle could even try to say she recognized in this weird new world. She stepped forth, and Philip broke the silence. "Not very talkative today, are we?" He chuckled to himself. "Well, that's an improvement over yesterday's stuttering, that's for sure," he jeered. Annie felt her hair stand up in shame. He was right, that's not how a hero would act. She sat herself on the log across from him. Philip gestured towards the campfire, vaguely waving his hand in its general direction. "Breakfast," he stated bluntly, and resumed gnawing on his own meal. "Is it ready yet?" Annabelle asked. "Huh?" Philip stopped eating for a second. Probably." She sat there for a moment, waiting for him to check the meal. He sat there, chewing on the last of his. It was an awkward minute for Annabelle as she slowly came to terms with the fact that she wasn't getting any better of an answer unless she asked again. Are you sure?" It was a shoddy question that didn't actually get anywhere, but Annabelle was too afraid to try anything more. All she knew was this man's name, and what little of his personality he'd shown her before was anything but promising. "Look, kid," he said, with a mouthful before swallowing his bite. "You can play chef all you want, he said, glaring her down, his arm resting on his leg as he leaned forwards with a hint of frustration. The memo was clear as Annie's heart dropped like a rock out of anxiety. She cautiously made her way towards the campfire as Philip went back to the last of his meal. Though he wasn't paying her any mind, she still felt as though her every move were being judged, like an actor who forgot their lines in the middle of a show. After grabbing the skewer, Annabelle made her way back to the stump she seated herself on. She had meals cooked over campfires before, but the skewer was weird. Those were usually used by festival vendors, not camping cookware, and they usually consisted of tiny pieces of exotic fruits, not one large hunk of meat. Oh well. However strange this all was, it was still breakfast, and her morning hunger was starting to kick in. Maybe getting a little energy in her system would make her feel better. She bit into the meat. It was uncomfortably stringy. Like a dying worm was being puppeteered down her throat. It was undercooked. It was uncomfortable. Some water might have helped to chase it down, though she didn't know where any was and was too afraid to ask just yet. Annabelle swallowed the bite, knowing it would be the only one she could muster. So much for breakfast today. Slow eater, eh? Philip noted. Annie had been trying to chew her way through her morning meal, if you could even call it that, but she had only gotten halfway through her food. She was getting used to the texture, but that didn't make it magically easier to stomach. It was all the food Annie was going to get for now, though, so she pushed on. She didn't speak, as doing so while chewing was rude, but even if she didn't have anything in her mouth, Annabelle wasn't sure she would have responded. Not that it seemed Philip wanted a response anyways, as he reached into his backpack and started rummaging for something. His arms and head dove in deeper than should have been possible, before suddenly popping back out to stare Annabelle down. Oh yeah, before you ask, Mordecai's just out to find you a void pack. He patted his backpack. Means more storage, and less need to swindle merchants or steal from a world on the brink. Annabelle had never heard of a void pack, but it became clear to her as Philip dived back into his bag what he really meant. She'd heard of these portable alternate realities, and even used some in her classes. They were perfect for containing cursed or volatile items, but they were rare, often flaunted by the rich as a show of their status, and hardly used with their actual purpose. Annie, however, knew them by a different name. A Hemley? She asked. Philip groaned, his voice echoing from within the bag. Oh, great. Rathead's already told you the weird way of saying it. I've only ever heard them called Hemleys, Annabelle replied. Well, you're weird, he said, pulling out a book and quill from his bag. Not that that's news, considering the rest of your town. When will Mordecai be back? Annie tried to brush the insult away. Philip flipped open the book. I don't know. 2 days if we're lucky, next month if we're not. Annabelle was confused. Hemleys weren't that rare, were they? Maybe the bigger ones were, since those were the real ways to flaunt implied wealth, but a small bag was common enough that almost every town had at least one for sale. Would it really take that long to find a small Hemley? A void bag, Philip muttered, tapping the page of his book with his quill, now inked. Sure, a bag's easy to come by, but Mordecai wanted a pack. He started scrawling on the page. You know, like a backpack or whatever. One of those. And that wasn't enough. He paused at turning the page. She insisted on finding someone who could make you a custom fit. His eyes, still focused on his writing, narrowed. I, for one, suggested we not waste our time with that. Philip rolled his eyes. But I guess she knows what the hell we're doing, and she's got the final say in this stupid thing. He closed the book and tossed it back in his Hemley. Whatever. Not my void pack, and not my guy to hunt. The last statement struck Annabelle as odd. Guy to hunt? She took another bite of her breakfast, hoping for this one to be different, only to be met with disappointment. Doesn't really matter. He stood up. Considering this world-ending craze, I'd be surprised if the guy was even alive at this point. But why hunt him? Philip sighed, slinging his backpack over his arm. Look, kid. She knows. I don't. You don't. Doesn't matter. He started walking towards the tent. We got camp to clean up and places to be. He looked back at her over his shoulder, piercing into her soul with his stare. So don't waste my time. Annabelle shut up. Beyond the campsite, the day was uneventful. Philip led the way as they traversed the woods, trudging down the winding gravel paths, hoping to stumble across something more substantial than a lone signpost. With every step, Annabelle's hopes of finding a town drained as the paths waltzed on through the forest, as though someone set them up specifically to spite her. Didn't help that breakfast was so unsubstantial, and she wasn't used to so much walking. Her legs ached as much as her stomach, though at least she got much-needed rests, as Philip occasionally stopped to take note of another thing in his book, even if only for a minute or two. Unfortunately, the pauses didn't do anything to help her growing appetite, nor her fear of the startling noises coming from the forest. Every falling rock, every rustled leaf, every gust of wind to put Annabelle on edge. Philip didn't seem to pay any mind, and considering his experience, there probably wasn't anything to be afraid of. She tried her best to set aside her fears. Annabelle had learned something that day. The words uneventful and good are not mutual. As the sunset began to light the sky with its dreamy mango-like tones, Philip ordered her to set up camp for the night and disappeared into the woods. While it was some respite from his worryingly strict silence, and it would have been a great opportunity to rest, Annabelle didn't dare to fail the job by giving in to her exhaustion. At least she knew how to do everything, having taken a Survival 25's class before. Philip returned long before she had finished setting up camp. Good thing the 25s taught her to light the fire first, as he pulled a deer out of his Hemley and strung it up over the fire without a single comment or complaint. In fact, he helped her finish setting up the tent, though it wasn't clear if he was staving off boredom while the deer cooked, or was frustrated with the fact that she hadn't finished already. The deer was fine. It could have been better if she took the time to prepare it, but Annabelle was too exhausted to push past Philip, and even if she could, she probably wouldn't have cooked it much better in her tired state. At least it was a filling meal, and this time Philip had got some water for her. It wasn't much water, but hey, it was something. Once dinner was done, Annabelle headed straight for bed. Her sleeping bag was uncomfortable, but it didn't matter. She was ready for some much-needed sleep after such a long, grueling day of nothing but walking. Her aching body was grateful, but her mind wasn't so pleasant tonight. As she fell asleep, yesterday's nightmares returned in full force, with a punch-to-the-gut kind of question her subconscious would dwell on through her dreams. Is Mom okay? Annabelle knew the answer. She didn't want to. Annabelle shot up, woken by a sudden crashing noise. She had just been dreaming of her mother cooking breakfast, and, well, that's sure what the crashing sounded like. A certain someone screwing up the pots and pans. She glanced around, trying to find the source of the noise. There wasn't much natural light. It must have only barely been morning by now, if you could even call it that. But she didn't have the time to really make out her surroundings. Philip's hand clasped over her mouth. This startled her, at first for why he would do such a thing, but then for the look on his face. He wasn't paying attention to her. He wasn't even looking at her. He pointed vaguely towards the tent flap, but Annabelle couldn't spot what he was so concerned by. There was nothing but the campfire's ash pit out there. And then she saw it. A paw. It was hard to see in the darkness, but she slowly adjusted and could barely make out the silhouette of a bear as it lumbered around the campsite, clawing the ground for something. Philip silently unsheathed his sword, getting ready to strike the bear, but before he could fully get up and ready, the noises stopped and the shadow disappeared. He still got up, and with a silent swipe, struck out into the dim campsite. It was a tense few seconds, doused in silence and shadow. It was soon broken by Philip's voice as he re-entered the tent. "It's gone, kid." Annie let out a sigh of relief as he reached for a small storm lantern. He held it up, flameless, and looked at Annabelle expectantly. "You know magic, right?" Yeah?" she responded. "You light it, then." She didn't know all there was to magic, but even if her Survival 25's training hadn't taught her the basics on starting a fire, she was a spark mage. All she needed to do was focus a little bit on her electrical powers to create some concentrated heat, and bam. Within around 15 seconds, the lamp lit up the whole room with a flickering, vibrant orange. Philip headed outside without a word, taking the lamp with him. His silhouette painted the tent flap in a crisp, clear outline. Annabelle got out of her sleeping bag, rubbed her eyes, grabbed her belongings, and headed outside after Philip. The campsite was a wreck, with everything thrown around like an accountant had lost their papers right as the tax collector knocked on their door. The fire pit was spread out, the logs they had used as benches were overturned, and the Hemley was wide open, with clothes, papers, and tools scattered around it. Philip slowly approached, leaned down, and peered in. After a few seconds, he let out a sigh. "You know, I had a second deer lined up for today's meals," he said, gritting his teeth in frustration. "But it looks like that thing's changed plans for breakfast today." He stood up and started walking for the tent again. "I hope you know how to hunt, kid." "I can trap rabbits, sir." It was a skill she barely remembered by now, and wasn't sure if she even knew the right order of every step, but it was what she did know, and was worth a shot nonetheless. Philip glared at her as he marched past her to get to the tent. "We've got 2 mouths to feed, kid. Rabbit ain't gonna cut it." Annie had no further ideas. What do we do, then?" Philip stopped in the tent flap. "Well, there's a bear with our breakfast out there. Why don't we go persuade him to give it back?" She should have protested. She really should have. But the time had come and gone, and they were far too deep into the trail to give up now. It had been, 15 minutes since they started? Philip was doing a good job of tracking down the bear. At least, based on what little Annabelle remembered on tracking animals, and what little she could see in the rising dawn. But a bear? Really? Sure, it had stolen their food, but why not go after something safer, simpler? Another deer, perhaps? Hell, even trapping rabbits would have been easier, even if they needed to trap 20 for the day, and even if she didn't remember how to do it. It was a long shot, but maybe he would still listen. You know, I think. Before she could finish a sentence, Philip shushed her, peering through the bushes. There it is, he whispered, gesturing for Annabelle to approach and look for herself. Lo and behold, there it was, chewing away on the deer's lifeless body. I'll deal with him, Philip said, standing up. You cause a distraction if things go south. I could... Annabelle started instinctively saying something, but stopped herself. She didn't need to complicate the situation any further. Philip had it under control. But he took notice, crouching back down. Could what, kid? There was no backing down now. I could kill it, sir, she said softly, trying not to alert the bear. Philip's face said it all. Unamused doubt. Considering your last tussle with one of these, kid, you know what? I'd love to see your best go at it. He sat back down, expectantly looking at her. Annabelle wasn't ready for this. She shouldn't have said anything. It would have been done in a moment had she just let Philip do his thing. It wasn't raining, making her plan much harder, but there was at least a cloud in the sky, so she wouldn't completely exhaust herself. It definitely wouldn't be a pleasant experience either way, but with Philip breathing down her neck, she had to do it. The bear was hardly moving. The cloud was in position. It was time to act. Closing her eyes as to not blind herself, Annie cast herself into the earth and into the sky. She couldn't see it, but she could sure hear it. The roaring thunder rolled over her like a dust storm on an open field, echoing off the distant hills as she channeled lightning through the bear and into the heavens. Or, well, the sounds echoed through her, as Annabelle's body ached from top to bottom and a painful ringing took over her ears. Maybe that was from the lightning, maybe the thunder, maybe from overexerting herself. She had remembered to close her eyes, but her failure to cover her ears and stand back from the blast hurt far more than she first planned. Her head was violently spinning as she opened her eyes. There was some good news. The bear was lying on its side. It was hard to tell if it was truly dead or not, as the movements could be some last pulses through its muscles, a hallucination, or a big problem, but Philip's sword being stuck through its head made its fate pretty clear. He stood there, one hand on its hilt, the other on his head as though to keep a migraine at bay. Annabelle lay down, looking at the canopy, waiting for it to stop shifting about so much. Water, she said instinctively, not even hearing her own voice. Lightning requires something to help it connect with the ground, and the best way is raindrops. On a bad day, though, the human body happens to have more than enough water to conduct such strong electricity, but any caster needs to stay well hydrated after exhausting themselves from a lightning strike, whether successful or not. Philip obliged, handing her his water bottle. She was able to mutter a quick, "Thank you," before chugging down as much as she could. Her lack of breakfast, and any drink that would come with it, compounded her thirst. Once the ringing subsided, the world finished spinning, and her thirst was quenched, Philip addressed her. I got 2 things to tell you, kid. He pulled his sword out of the bear and turned towards her. 1, that was damn impressive. He kneeled down, getting face to face with Annabelle. 2, don't you dare do that again so close. This has been No Home for a Hero, Chapter 3. Thank you all for joining. Sorry for such a long delay. I know 3 months is a long time between chapters, but I hope you all enjoy, and I'll see you all in the next one.